So we've been seeing a lot of crazy stuff happen here with World War One. But what was America doing all this time? Where was the United States? Well, isolationism. So what's going on here is the United States really didn't like, and they never really have liked, but really didn't like the idea of getting involved in European affairs. In fact, they wanted Europeans to stay out of Western Hemisphere affairs. They didn't want to do business in the name of warfare with the Europeans. So they refused to fight, but they were sympathetic to the Allies because we really share in the United States a very similar historical legacy and very, very similar culture to the Europeans. But the problem is, everyone in the United States knew that from studying history, European wars tend to last a very long time, and they didn't seem to be any real apparent advantage to the United States getting involved. But there really kind of was when you think about some of the economics at stake here. Many lenders to the allied countries were the United States. All right, so people in the U.S. were lending stuff and also had trade deals and whatnot with the allied nations. And so if no repayments were made by the allies, then, or I guess if the allies lost the war, no payments would be made back to pay debts that had been loaned out to many of these European countries. And so in a way, some people might have been all for war from the get-go, but in general, the American populace was not for it. So this would start to change as the United States' economic interests became more and more under attack by Germany's military policies. Here's an example. The Lusitania was a ship that had only 128 Americans out of more than 1,200 people. Okay, so this ship was going back and forth between the United States and Europe, and the Germans kind of thought, well, hey, this ship they definitely have weapons on board. We're gonna blow it up, and we're gonna get rid of it because we don't want weapons going into Europe to be used against us. And so Germany sank the ship in the waters around Britain. They were saying, we're going to sink basically any ship in the waters around Britain. And this really outraged the United States because they're thinking, wow, 128 of our people died because of a European war. Germany can't determine who gets to go on international waters or who gets to go back and forth between these countries because we're just kind of doing our thing. You guys do what you want to do. Well, this right here was the first strike. Germany ultimately did agree not to blow up any other neutral ships. Now, here's the other thing, too, when it comes to Lusitania, is that it did, in fact, have some weapons on it that could be used against the Germans, but it still was a sore spot with the Americans in terms of German-American relations. Now, I think really what is the point that draws the United States in beyond any shadow of a doubt, though, would be this Zimmerman telegram. So what happens with this is Arthur Zimmerman, who is the foreign secretary for Germany during this time, sent a telegram to Mexico asking them to make war against the United States. And in return, Arthur and the Germans would help Mexico to reconquer lost land that was taken during the United States Manifest Destiny we talked about in the last unit. So the United States intercepted the telegram, and they were super mad about this agreement, about this effort the Germans were making to get the Mexicans to fight against them. And so this right here was the last straw, and this is what brought the United States into the war on the side of the Allies. So this was 1917. The Russians had just bowed out of the war officially under the Bolsheviks, and the United States would come later on the same year, and the Central Powers were beginning to weaken. In fact, really everyone was really, really tired of the fighting, and all the troops were demoralized, and just the war seemed to gain no progress for anyone and go on forever and ever. But the real advantage here is that the Allies they were reinvigorated by the fresh blood that was being brought in by the United States. So you gotta think is that all the propaganda and everything had begun to wane. People had started to really see the realities of the war, and they were tired of it. But the United States, those troops were gung-ho. It's kind of like a game of ultimate frisbee when you've been playing for an hour and a half, and then somebody comes in and they want to join the game, and they join on the team that's losing, and now all of a sudden the team that's losing is winning uncontrollably because of this one person. Well, it's kind of the same thing. Someone with a fresh mentality towards the war can make a big difference in its outcome. And the United States, not only were they a strong military force at this time, but for them to come into the war and be completely fresh and ready to go really changed the tide of the battle for sure, in turn, I guess, in favor of the Allies. So, Austria-Hungary ends up dealing with revolution. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire surrenders. By November the 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II is going to step down. By November 11th, which is Armistice Day, known today as Veterans Day, this here is going to be where the war actually and officially ends in 1918. So if you want to look right here at World War I's legacy, it still it impacts us in some form or fashion today. We tend to look at this whole period, the idea behind the world wars, as like almost like the era of, we definitely consider World War II the era of the greats. But I mean, it wasn't until recently that we had our last World War I that passed away. This is not that far in the past. And if you look at the population structure, like a population pyramid that shows European population over time, you can definitely see the impact that this war made due to the number of casualties. If you look at the number of soldiers that fought in the war on either and both sides, it's over 60 million people were in some form or fashion directly involved in this war. You can see the different casualties over here on this part of the chart that shows how many people were injured or killed during the war. A whole generation of Europeans were lost to death. There was economic ruin in Europe. There was a breakup of old empires, and really, probably importantly, this very, very strong sense of disillusionment and insecurity that would emerge in Europe and other parts of the world that really began to get people thinking about, is democracy right for us? What else can we do? Are we going to be able to recover from this terrible thing? What happened to us? What can we ever do to fix it? And so this disillusionment really is going to kind of mark the next era that we're going to discuss in this course, leading up to the Second World War. And speaking of which, I want to talk about how this war ended. And it ends with a treaty which you must know, called the Treaty of Versailles. No, war is over. The Big Four, they're going to be the ones that get together and talk about how this war is going to be repaired. How is the world going to move on from here? Now, the Big Four are essentially the leaders of the winning countries. Woodrow Wilson, the United States; George Clemenceau for France; David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain; Vittorio Orlando is the leader of Italy. Now, the Russians didn't have any kind of leadership here in these agreements, because they had already withdrawn from the war using a separate treaty because they were dealing with internal struggles. Now, Woodrow Wilson, he wanted to come up with a lasting peace, and he believed that the only way we could do this would be to be fair towards the Germans and figure out a way that we can move on with what happened in a way that's not going to make them want revenge later on. Britain and France, however, they wanted to punish Germany, and they wanted no more power for them. They wanted to completely, rub it in their face that they lost, more or less, and end this. So Woodrow Wilson came up with this 14 points plan, which is designed to create this lasting peace that he would like to have. And here is how the 14 points plan looked. And this is just a summary of them, but point 1 through 4 would be the idea of ending secret treaties that led to the alliances, for example, freedom of seas, reduced armies and navies. We don't need all this stuff. To have them is to set ourselves up for another Jurassic War later on. Point number 5, no more colonies. Let's get rid of the colonies that we have and enable people to live independent lives. Point 6 through 13 has to do with the changing borders. New nations should be carved out of countries that are looking for self-determination or looking for opportunities to govern themselves in the nation-state form. And then also, number 14, probably the most important of the things that Woodrow Wilson had proposed, was this League of Nations, an alliance, more or less, of different countries that would be able to work out their problems through diplomacy and through international law rather than through fighting. And that right there was probably, certainly, the most important part of the 14 points plan. The wrong way there. But the problem is that not all the points were accepted. All right, so not everyone accepted all points. Some were, but especially with redrawing the lines and the breaking up of the Ottoman Empire. But others, such as colonies, were not something that countries with a lot of colonial possessions, like Great Britain, were willing to do. But there was also this war guilt clause within Article 231 of the treaty, which essentially said, Germany, it's all your fault. And they forced Germany to pay basically all the reparations for Europe's problems. Germany lost territory. They lost Alsace-Lorraine back to France. Alsace-Lorraine was a very rich industrial region that the Germans had taken during the Franco-Prussian War. And this was kind of seen as a peace built on quicksand because of all these things. And another reason why it's seen as a peace built on quicksand is the United States actually never joined the League of Nations. Now wait, this is really ironic because Woodrow Wilson was the U.S. president who came up with the idea for the League of Nations. But problem is, it needed to be approved by Congress, and Congress was incredibly against the idea of putting themselves in the midst of European politics and affairs. They wanted to stay out, and they thought that the League of Nations would be a way of forcing them to get involved every single time Europe has a squabble. And so because of their isolationist attitude, Congress refused to join the League of Nations. And so it's almost like you come up with this great idea and then someone else has to take it over and you can't even get it started. Needless to say, the League of Nations never really had any power and was going to be a major fail and did not prove or did not result in reducing the chance of another grand scale war. Obviously, World War II is going to happen. Spoiler alert! The war guilt clause also left a bad taste in Germany's mouth. So the Germans resented the end of this war and the reparations and the struggles that they would have to endure as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. Colonialism didn't really end. People in Asia and Africa still want independence, and they're not going to get it anytime soon. So, needless to say, the wheels were set in motion for the next World War, only a few decades away. I'll see you in the next unit. And yes, we're done.